Hi everyone, and welcome back to class. In our last discussion, we looked at David Halperin's classic article, Is There a History of Sexuality? And having answered this question in the affirmative, it would seem that we're ready to begin exploring this history. But not so fast. Before we get to talking about past sexual cultures, I first want to spend a little time talking about historians, about the ways they've approached this subject, about the specific topics they've explored, about the kinds of questions they've asked, about the kinds of sources they've examined, and about the kinds of scholarship they've produced. I want to give you a feel for what the history of sexuality as a disciplinary field is like. Focusing on historians and their scholarship is really valuable because it gives us a behind-the-scenes look at what this field is really all about what its goals and aims and objectives are, about the intended audience of this scholarship, and about its approach to history. As we're going to see, these have all changed quite a lot over the years, and learning about how earlier historians built up this field helps us figure out what we want it to be and where we think it should go in the future. In other words, what we're going to be doing in this lecture is exploring the historiography of sexuality. This might be a new word for you, but don't let that scare you. Basically, historiography is a fancy academic term we use whenever we're talking about people like me, that is, people who write history. Historiography is the study of the way history is written. When we do historiography, we're not studying the events of the past. Instead, we're looking at how individual historians have interpreted those events. We're looking at trends in the scholarship in an attempt to get a sense of what the field looks like as a whole. Looking at the historiography of sexuality, we can ask, when did this field first emerge, and for what reasons? How has the field changed over the years, and what propelled those changes? What's the current state of the field, and what kinds of questions should historians of sexuality be devoting to themselves right now? So, when did something we might call the history of sexuality come into existence as a field of study? Just like the word sexuality, this is actually a pretty new thing. If we're asking about when people first became interested in systematically analyzing past sexual cultures, the answer is the Enlightenment. Before getting into this a bit more, let me say first a couple things. One, the individuals doing this work were not academics or professional historians. Secondly, the work they were doing was more along the lines of collecting and compiling than writing. But still, it counts. In the 18th century, all across Europe, various men of means became interested in recovering ancient texts from Greece and Rome that dealt with various sexual topics. As they acquired these texts, they began assembling bibliographies, that is, lists of all known writings on sex. The practice continued into the 19th century. One of the most famous collectors of that century was Henry Spencer Ashby, who in 1877 published a reference guide called A Catalogue of Books Which Should Be Prohibited. Ashby's catalog was basically a list of historical erotica. He was one of many Victorians who wrote histories of obscene books from the past, and gradually, this work led to the creation of the genre of writing that we today call pornography. It was around this same time that a small group of European writers began to actually analyze the sexual cultures of the past. Here we see, for the very first time, the history of sexuality acquiring a somewhat official status, as the individuals doing this writing were often academics or other kinds of professionals. One of the first to get involved was the British historian John Addington Symonds, who in 1874 published a paper called A Problem in Greek Ethics. Symonds was writing at a time in which the word homosexuality had just come into existence, and his 1874 essay was written as a response to those who believed that same-sex sexual attraction was both new and immoral. Symonds disagreed with both of these ideas, and his essay called attention to the existence of homoeroticism in ancient Greece. After pointing this out, Symonds added that the Greeks were incredibly tolerant of same-sex love. Given that the ancient Greeks were a revered people, seen by most as the creators of Western civilization, Symonds' point was clear. If a society as highly esteemed as ancient Greece accepted homosexuals, then so too should our contemporary society. This was the basic aim of scholarship at this point. It aimed to show how behaviors deemed immoral in the present were widely accepted in the past, and then proceeded to criticize contemporary morals and argue for a return to the more enlightened age of the past. Sexologists contributed to this literature as well. Indeed, one of the key ways they advocated for greater freedoms for sexual minorities was by pointing out examples of men and women in the past who enjoyed same-sex sexual pleasures without censure. From these investigations, a belief emerged that historical knowledge was key to explaining contemporary problems in human sexuality. The assumptions, questions, and perspectives laid down in the late 1800s cast a long shadow over the history of sexuality. Three things about this era's historical scholarship are especially notable, and I want to call attention to each of them in turn. The first concerns the way these writers conceptualized sexual desire. From the Enlightenment through the late 19th century, the unquestioned assumption was that sexuality was a natural force, a biological drive that people were born with. In other words, these historians were all what we would today call essentialists. To use more modern terminology, they believed that gay people existed across time and cultures, that is, that there had always been homosexuals. Secondly, they conceived of the history of sexuality in liberationist terms, as a research project whose ultimate goal was the emancipation of the sexually marginalized. They believed that the history of sexuality was essentially a battle between two opposing groups. One group trying to fight for the right to live their lives as they wished, and another representing the forces of repression that sought to prevent the practice of behaviors they labeled deviant, immoral, sinful, degenerate, and the like. These historians placed themselves with the first group. They saw history as a means of activism, of advancing the interests of sexual minorities. Third, because of this, their focus was almost exclusively on the oppressed, on those people denied the rights, privileges, and freedoms that heterosexuals enjoyed. Now, having learned all of this, we might now ask, how much has changed in the scholarship over the last 100 plus years? The answer, as succinctly as I can state it, is this. Some things have changed a lot, and others not much at all. We'll deal with the changes first. Here, the biggest contrast has to do with historians' conceptions of sexuality. From the 1960s onward, the idea that sexuality is fundamentally social has become more and more accepted. And as a result of this, the older notion that gay people have always existed has been replaced by a constructionist agenda that looks at how cultures produce new and varied kinds of desires, identities, orientations, and behaviors. And with this, earlier narratives about the battle between the oppressed and their oppressors have gradually ceded ground to more complicated stories, examining exactly how individuals and institutions actively create sexual cultures and subcultures. The key figure in this shift was Michel Foucault, the French philosopher whose 3-volume History of Sexuality fundamentally reshaped the field. We're not going to read the introductory book of this trilogy in class, but I really, really highly recommend it. It's a fascinating read that fundamentally overturns everything you think you know about sexuality. It would be hard to summarize the contents of this book right now, but the key argument has something to do with what Foucault calls the repressive hypothesis. popularized by early 20th century psychiatrists, the repressive hypothesis is basically the idea that from the 18th century onward, Western governments and their allies increasingly strove to silence all discussions of sex and to prohibit all forms of sexual behavior aside from reproductive marital intercourse. Foucault turns this narrative on its head. Instead of seeing more and more sexual repression over the last few hundred years, he sees the opposite, more and more incitement to speak about sex, and the proliferation of an ever more expansive vocabulary for classifying sexual desire and behavior. The central actors in Foucault's history are sexologists and psychiatrists, whose writings were responsible for creating new sexual categories, taxonomies, and identities that remain with us to this very day. After Foucault, it became impossible to see sexuality as a timeless biological essence. After Foucault, the history of sexuality was no longer about sexual desire's struggle for free expression, but about the cultural construction of that desire and the myriad factors that worked to produce it. It represented a sea change in the historiography, a watershed moment that has left a deep imprint on the field ever since. Though Foucault has many critics, it is impossible to overstate the importance of his writings. Without him, the history of sexuality today would be a very different thing. With Foucault, the history of sexuality started to become a mainstream academic discipline, something that one could specialize in and hold university positions in. A key moment in the growth of the field was the creation of the Journal of the History of Sexuality, whose first issue was published in 1990. As professional historians started paying more and more attention to sexuality, they began integrating this into other better studied phenomena like wars, diplomacy, revolutions, popular culture, and everyday life. In doing this, they began to argue that focusing on sexuality yielded new insights about everything from the Enlightenment to the French Revolution to industrialization to European imperialism to Tsarism, Nazism, communism, and the Americanization of the world after 1945. Sexuality forced historians to rethink developments in ways not previously considered. As one historian put it in the 1990s, it was as if sex was suddenly everywhere at once. Despite the explosion in historical scholarship on sexuality that has emerged from the 1990s onward, in many ways, the discipline still bears the imprint of its founders. Most notably, up until quite recently, the history of sexuality is almost synonymous with the history of homosexuality, which has remained the central object of concern since the 1800s. Only in the last couple decades have historians begun to move from the margins to the center, from the deviant to the normal. Though we now have the beginnings of a literature on the history of straight people and of heterosexuality, this is quite new. The topic is still in its infancy. A second oversight has to do with the historical actors populating accounts of sexuality. For the most part, academics have been far more interested in what doctors, sexologists, and other sex experts have said about sexuality than how lay people have understood themselves and the kinds of sexual behaviors they've engaged in. To a great extent, the overarching concern within the historiography is discourse, not sex acts. Thirdly, the discipline still remains stubbornly Eurocentric in focus. Despite the emergence of fields like global history, and despite the growing popularity of Asian, African, and Middle Eastern history, outside the West, the history of sexuality remains a comparatively underdeveloped field. One of the big questions here is whether it's appropriate to use terms and categories first developed in a European context, including the concept of sexuality itself, when discussing sexual matters within non-European contexts. All right, we're going to have to leave it there for now. Thanks for tuning in to this whirlwind tour of the history of sexuality. We could talk about this a lot more, and we're going to have a chance to do so later on in the semester. But for now, I have some questions for you that I'd like you to respond to. You can see these on the screen right here. Look forward to seeing you on the discussion board. Bye-bye.